guys, we are here in Lake Placid this week, so I'm bringing you guys a video from Lake Placid. We are snowboarding and skiing today. Here, let me just show you some of the snowy views we've got. Stick around after the video and I will show you guys some of the stuff that we are doing here this week, because we are not only just skiing and snowboarding, but we're going to try out a couple of the things. There's a whole Olympic park here. There's the Olympic jumps and everything. So hopefully we'll get some cool shots for you all to see. All right, stick around later. Bye. So wrist strength is something that I first started paying attention to way back when I started snowboarding. I loved skiing, I loved snowboarding, but when I started snowboarding is when I really realized that the constant falling and catching yourself on your hands was putting a lot of strain on my wrists. So I really started paying attention to how I took care of my wrists, how I stretched them out, how I strengthened them, way back then. And then I kind of stopped because I stopped snowboarding, I wasn't into it all the time. And when I started yoga, I did not realize that even though I wasn't falling and like really jamming pressure into my wrists, that just holding myself up on my hands, which is not something that we do on a daily basis, can put just as much pressure on those wrists. So I am here now. I don't know if you can tell, this is a completely different background from normal. We are actually in Lake Placid at Whiteface, and we're getting some snowboarding in, we're getting some skiing in, and it just made me want to share with you guys some of the different wrist stretches that I like to do. For a while, during my yoga practice, I actually had to stay off of my hands completely because I had not paid enough attention to my wrists. And it really injured my yoga practice because I was, trying to get into handstands. Meanwhile, I was also in the process of building up a lot of upper body strength through yoga, which is something that I was no longer able to do now that I didn't have my hands. So I'm going to show you a couple different wrist stretches that you can do, and then I'm going to show you a couple modifications for those of you who do have wrist injuries, for what you can do to kind of switch your hands up and help make it a little bit easier so that poses are still attainable even if you have an injury. So here's what I've got. First off, I like to start with just some wrist rolls. You roll them in one direction, you roll them in the other direction. And typically, if I have the time for it, I will do each of these for at least a minute each. If you don't have the time for it, obviously, you don't have to. I've kind of modified it to be able to get done in, 5 minutes before a yoga practice when I show up to the studio. So, you get a little bit of these, shake the wrists out. Some people like to bring their arms up above their head when they do this. And the reason that this works is because it helps kind of strengthen the arms a little bit, and it also makes you work a little bit harder because now the blood flow has to travel up the arms. So you're working just a little bit harder having your wrists up above your head. Again, you can twirl in both directions, shake the wrists out. The most important one is when you're down on the ground, but that can add a lot of pressure. So here's a little trick for in between. You just take your hand out right in front of you and you pull gently back on your fingers. So you can start with the fingertips up and pull back. And you're going to feel this stretch actually all the way up the forearm. And then you can point the fingertips down and again pull gently. So a lot of people will tell you specifically to pull on your fingertips. I actually pull on my hand because your fingers move and they're not as strong. So if you pull on the actual hand, the meaty part of your hand, and the palm rather than the fingertips, then you're really concentrating that stretch on the wrist rather than all of the knuckles in your hand. And we'll go ahead and do the other side. Again, you can do fingertips up, pressing in. And down. So this is kind of a passive way of doing it, which is great. There's also a more active way. Those of you who have gotten shin splints before, you may know this from shin splints. You'll have someone like press down on your toes, right? And then you want to try to bring your toes up, or they'll press back on the bottoms of your feet and you're trying to point your toes. So the same principle can be applied with your wrists. So instead of passively just letting your right hand control that left hand and stretch out the wrist, you're going to use that right hand again. You're going to press up against that left hand. And instead of just letting it go, you are going to press up against that right hand with your left hand. So I know it doesn't look like I'm doing anything different, but I am really pressing into my right hand right now with my left. I'm really trying to lift the left hand up. Granted, my wrist is not as strong as my back and my biceps are, so there's no way that my left hand's ever going to make it up. But it helps to strengthen the wrist a little bit. You can do the same thing in the opposite direction. So here I go again, pulling with the right hand, pushing with my left hand. And it becomes less of a stretch and more of a way to build some strength in the wrist. So doing the same thing on the other side, pressing against now with that right hand. So these ones where you're really pressing into it, holding it for a minute straight can be extremely exhausting and extremely hard. One of the things you can do is do like a 10 seconds on, 2 seconds off, or 15 seconds on, 5 seconds off, whatever floats your boat, whatever you can handle the most, and just kind of build your way up. The best key is really just to keep it consistent. So if you can keep it consistent for the whole minute, whether you're doing, 10 on, 2 off, 15 on, 5 off, whatever it is, 30 on, 10 off, whatever it is, just try to keep it consistent for that whole minute, and then work your way up to if you can hold for a whole minute. So that's how you can do it, and it's a little bit more mild when you're doing it and you're pressing against yourself. If you want to make it a little bit harder, you can press against the floor. The reason it's harder on the floor is because it's not you. It's a very solid surface, and you're now adding body weight because we're now standing over our hands. I've got hair everywhere. But the reason I like doing it on the floor is it can be a lot different. So you've got a lot of different variations, a lot of different options here. So I'm starting off with my fingertips facing forward, my palms flat on the floor, and then I'm just gently circling. So you really just want to circle to feel if there's any kind of pinching, or if there's any spot that kind of hurts a little bit more than others, or anything that's tight. And when you find that spot, you just kind of work it out. Linger in that area. And then you can go ahead and switch up your hands too. So I'm going to show you some of the different options that I like to use. You can do fingertips facing out, still palms flat on the floor. You're rocking side to side here. You can do palms on the floor, fingertips facing you. And my favorite one to do here is just to lean back towards your heels and just get a really deep stretch in the forearms. It's also going to really get that bend going in the wrists as well as stretching the forearms. And then also you can do fingertips facing each other. Palms flat on the floor. And in these variations, you can play with how much weight you're putting on your wrists as much as you're playing with the movement of the wrist itself. So I like to just shake out the wrists as often as possible when I'm putting that much pressure on them, because I do have fairly weak wrists. And especially when you're starting out, if you're doing a lot of floor work, give yourself breaks. Don't let your wrists completely tire out. That's one of the mistakes that we make as yogis in general. Also, when we're first starting out to work on our wrists, you want to make sure that you're giving your wrists as much relaxation and rest as you possibly can, because we are working our wrists crazy amounts. All right, so there's that. Now we're going to go ahead and try palms up. So this is a little bit different. So you do palms up. I'm doing fingertips facing away from me. And again, just some circles. Being mindful of the weight that we're applying now, because this is completely different. This is not even what we're used to as yogis. And the same variations are here. You can do fingertips towards each other. Fingertips back towards you. Fingertips away from each other. And again, you have the option here of kind of rocking back and forth and rotating on each one. So those are the different options to kind of stretch out. So again, you can press into. So if your hands are flat on the floor, you've got palms down, fingertips facing away, you can again, I like to rock as forward as I possibly can, and then try to lift the palms of the hands up off the floor. So it's a very small movement. You're really not going to see it in this video, but if you can imagine yourself lifting your palms up off the floor as if you were trying to come kind of onto your fingertips. And you'll feel your entire wrist begin to engage. You'll feel your hand really get into the right position for those of you who are practicing handstands and wanting to get your hands in the right position, which is almost like a cup in your palm. So learning to get into that handstand position, you're going to do almost the same thing. So you'll start to feel it in your wrists, in your hands as you get into that lifting the wrist up a little bit. Another thing that I like to do while I'm working on my wrist strength is to work on my fingertip strength. So simply come to your fingertips. And for me, this is difficult because I have double jointed fingers. So my fingers automatically go into this super weird, creepy, locked out mode, or they just bend backwards. For most of you, this won't be an issue. For those of you who have fingers that hyperextend or double jointed fingers, that's what you really want to make sure that doesn't happen. You want to kind of keep the knuckle bent in the right direction and hold yourself up that way. For everyone else, straighten your fingers out as much as possible and then start to apply the weight. So you're going to start back on your heels so that there's no weight on your hands, and then slowly rock forwards. Start to feel that weight. Check the fingers. Continue applying weight. And there it is. And then you just hold. And you do the same thing that you did while you were holding, when you were stretching out your wrists. You know, start with a 5 on, 2 off, work your way to a 10 on, 5 off, or 15, 5, 30, 10, and just work your way into a little bit more fingertip strength. Most people aren't going to ask you to have fingertip strength. As yogis, it's one of the things that we do. For those of you who like to get fancy with your push-ups, fingertip push-ups are fun to do. So those are a few different reasons why you would want to have your fingertips be strong. Those of you who work with grip strength, or anything that's hanging on a bar, having strong fingertips is going to help with that. It's actually the reason I originally got into fingertip strength, is that I cut my tendon in my hand and I never had very good grip strength. So I could do all of these exercises, but when it came to consistently holding on to the bar, I was constantly having to drop and readjust my hand, or doing a pull-up and kind of doing that like gymnastics jump to re-grab the bar. And I just really never had the strength to hold on to the bar. So I had to start working on my fingertip strength so I could start working on my grip strength, and that's just one of the things I started to do. So good for yoga, good for fitness, really regardless of what it is you're doing, fingertip strength is a plus. So the last thing I wanted to show you is some modifications. For those of you who already have wrist injuries, what can you do if you want to continue to practice? So first and foremost, the most obvious is taking it down to the forearms. Very simple, you know, you go from regular plank, just take it right down to the forearms. Now, the reason that this is not my favorite is because a lot of times you're not just staying in plank. Especially for those of you who are using this specifically for yoga, from plank you normally move into like a downward dog, right? And that can become extremely hard. It's a lot harder to do a dolphin, which is on the forearms, it's a downward dog in the forearms, rather than just doing a regular downward dog. It's completely different. It opens your shoulders differently. It makes it a very different stretch. So what I actually used to do is I would sit there in class, take all of my rings off, and I would do the class on my fists. The reason I like this better is it actually makes me focus on my wrists. So while you're balancing on your wrists, you can try this at home. This is another way for you to kind of strengthen your wrists. Balance on your wrists in plank. And just notice if your wrists kind of come inwards. Oh, fingers cracking there. If your wrists come inwards, they bend in a little bit, maybe they bend out a little bit. And just notice and try to keep your wrist as straight up and down as possible. What I mean by this, when you're in your plank, you may notice that your wrists are going to do this. And then all of a sudden you've got like this weird conjoining looking, I don't even know how to describe it because I've only ever seen it while I'm in practice, and I'm like, how are my wrists doing this? How is my body being held up? And that's your wrist literally telling you it's not strong enough to be able to hold you, and that's when you need to come down to the forearms. But you can practice it, and you want to keep that wrist straight line. Think about like throwing a punch. When you're throwing a punch, the one thing they tell you is to really like hold your wrist nice and steady. You want to hit with the two knuckles, you know, so everything's straight, right? And that's how you want to be able to hold your wrist when you're on the floor. When you start to notice your wrist going like this, that's when you need to remind yourself, move the wrist back into place. And doing it on your fists here is really what's going to help you to notice where the inabilities are, where the weaknesses are, how long you're able to actually hold yourself on your wrist, how long you should be spending on the floor, on your hands, and being able to kind of rein it back, tone it back, and really just make sure that you're doing what your wrist can actually handle rather than what you want them to handle. So those are my tips for you guys today. I hope this helps, whether you're working on your grip strength, whether you're working on wrist strength, whether you're skiing, snowboarding, yogaing, whatever the case may be. I really hope this helps because our wrists are so important. We only ever get 2 of them in our lifetime, and they are so much to us. All right, so I hope this helps, and see you guys next week.
Tom and Savannah.
Time 48:42 for Tom and